Welcome to another episode of the Being and Doing podcast, where I try to create a space for the unique minds that are all around us and to bring their stories that will hopefully change or inspire or challenge some of your views about reality and the world. And tonight I have with me Dr. Lou Cozolino, which, as I said just before we started this interview, is a sort of a personal hero. So this would be a first. And the reason I really admire Dr. Cozolino is that he's one of those poet scientists that he kind of describes in one of his books. And in addition to his immense expertise, what I observed from all the interviews I have watched, there is this expertise is backed up by a wonderful and warm personality. And this is the reason that I really wanted Dr. Cozolino on this podcast. And I hope you will be, and I hope I will be able to actually bring my impression through this conversation to all of you. So welcome, Dr. Cozolino, and really I'm grateful that you accepted this invitation.
My pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I will start by just asking you a simple question of what are the few words, it can be nouns or adjectives, that you would describe yourself with?
A few adjectives. The first thing that comes to mind is curious. The second, I guess, something that I aspire to is empathy and compassion. And so I guess my studies and also the writings, I try to combine information with compassion, and hopefully that, those two things together result in some sort of wisdom that will benefit other people.
And I would like to get on the curiosity. So what I love about curiosity is that kind of keeps us in this open state of mind. Mm-hmm. And it's something that is, as we know, important in therapy. So I'm curious how you are cultivating this openness and this state of constant questioning.
I guess, probably the roots of it is from my childhood, growing up around people who were incredibly certain about their perspectives and obviously wrong, right, to everyone except themselves. So I think from very early in life, I was impressed by how deluded human beings are. And I guess I came to appreciate also how deluded I must be. And so it's just this, my attraction to science, I think, is the hope of figuring out some sort of a methodology where we can sort of work around our human biases, because our brains, the human brain, as far as I can tell evolutionarily, the brain evolved to believe. It didn't evolve to know or to think, rationally. And so all of us humans have this real handicap, because what we're looking for are simple answers to complex questions to relieve our anxiety about our ignorance, right? So I think and so that's a piece of it. And the other piece of it, I don't really know where it came from. I just found, in contrast to many people that I know, and there must just be part of biodiversity. Like, some people are just endlessly curious about everything, and that's something that I've never had to cultivate. That's something that has always been true for me, and it was a problem early in life because I kept bouncing from one study to another, from one major to another. I think I had 4 majors in my first year of college. And so I think that there's this sort of experiential component, and then there's this sort of natural, which I guess must be like some sort of genetically mediated thing that just makes me never accept the answers that I'm given. And so I've always been attracted to people who and my idols are, or my heroes are people, like Carl Rogers, like Oliver Sacks, E.O. Wilson, people like that who really, uh, in the face of all sorts of other or sort of other perspectives that were dominating the scientific scene, were actually able to take a deep dive into something that was very unique to them and a very unique expression of who they are. Oliver Sacks, for example, he was a neurology resident at UCLA about 5 years before I got there. And all I ever heard about Oliver was how upset he made everyone because he never really presented what you expected him to present. And he was never, and his notes were always disorganized. His patient charts were lost often. He was just always in his head thinking about the next horizon or the next world. And he didn't do very well day to day. He didn't please the people around him who had OCD. Let's put it that way.
And actually, there are two questions that stem from this. One for me is, in terms of curiosity and the difficulty to handle the anxiety of uncertainty, I was actually wondering, and in one of your lectures, you were talking about, I don't want to be called expert. I want you to question me as well. And I was wondering, can we somehow go towards a society which will constantly question, but still keep a certain level of stability? Because in one place, we need to make decisions fast, and people who are longer in an area will eventually kind of be able to do that faster than others. And then on the other hand, we still want to teach people how to question things and how to always listen to themselves. So I'm just wondering, what's your take on this, and how we can implement it in society in a better way?
Yeah. Well, maybe the problem is with the word expert connotes that's the final word.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, over and over and over, in my experience, the experts are the block to new ways of thinking, to new learning. One of my favorite examples of that was a fellow who used to, I think he was the editor of the Journal of Neuroscience, which was the sort of the key journal at the time. And his belief was, and the standing dogma was, that there was no neurogenesis in the human brain.
Mm.
And he wouldn't accept any articles or publish any articles that had findings that showed neurogenesis in the human brains. And I think it was Elizabeth Phelps and a number of other. It was interesting. It was all young women who found data or support for this notion of human neurogenesis. And finally, he just sort of did a begrudging acknowledgement, right? So I think that's the type of expertise that is something I call hardening of the categories,
Mm-hmm.
right? It also stifles work, and I felt the same way. I was really, because I had a theory early on from my work that in schizophrenia involved hippocampal disorganization. Neurons, especially pyramidal cells, being disorganized in the hippocampus. And everyone I submitted the paper to just said, you don't know what you're talking about. And, it was like, this isn't, and then, of course, a few years later, one of my teachers, Dr. Scheibel, discovered with one of his students hippocampal pyramidal disorganization. And I wasn't doing the biological research. I was looking at the animal research and the clinical research from schizophrenics. I said there's too much of an overlap between the behavioral manifestations to not think there's something not going on here. So, that's why I think I really encourage my students to, I tell all of them, don't believe anything that I say. Just consider it, play with it, because a lot of the things I was taught by the experts is now wrong. So just keep an open mind. So I think the question you're asking about how do we stay sort of balanced and be uncertain simultaneously. I think it takes sort of a bit of personal security. Like you can't base your own safety and security on certainty. You
Mm.
have to base it on your ability to deal with whatever comes and have confidence in yourself that you'll be able to develop new hypotheses and new decisions based on new data.
So
Right? I think that's the scientific perspective.
that's actually, since I'm as well a scientist, it's something I'm really thinking about is how do we work with the young minds in a way that we don't inhibit them, that we actually nurture the potential we have in society. Because what I often observe in science is that there is a lot of struggle for the young minds, for the gifted minds, to actually overcome what you would call the hardening of the categories. So I'm just wondering, basically, do you observe a shift in this sense, or it's just something that you were able to build for yourself and your students? And if so, how did you build that? What is it that you model for your students so that they feel safe to question you?
Well, I mean, I think I started this with my son, who's now 14. I started when he was very young, just saying he'd ask me a question, and I would say, "Here's what I think, but that's my opinion." And I'm often wrong. Let's check it out. So then we would go to the computer or go to the dictionary or the encyclopedia or whatever resources that we have. So it's backfired a little bit because now when I say anything to him, he says, "Well, Dad, you're often wrong," right? Um, but I think the education, the schools that he's gone to, which I've been able to select, are schools that have that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a piece of it. And I do the same thing in a different way in my classes. Is first of all, I tell people, like, here's the current state of the art,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'll present, if I talk about attachment theory, for example, I'll say, well, this is the theory, and here are the strengths and the things that are attractive about it. But on the other hand, I don't think you can reduce attachment to these categories. And you see that there's plasticity in these categories over time. And so these are adaptational patterns. So don't get too attached to attachment theory,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's the same thing if they're talking about consciousness. Or, Crick had a theory of consciousness. There are dozens of theories of consciousness. None of them have convinced me, but they're all interesting,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's really, I think, a matter of this came as I'm thinking about it. It came to me when I started as an undergraduate. I studied philosophy, and I focused on ancient Indian philosophy. And one of the things that I don't know, maybe it was my teacher's peculiar interpretation, but he talked about the ancient practices in India. The idea was that every reality sort of arises, and there's this notion of Sanskrit of interdependent co-origination. In other words, everything sort of arises together in a complex system, and then those things. And if you go to another system, you have a whole nother set of variables, right? And I think that was true in ancient India. Many of my professors who studied at the University of Chicago talked in terms about different mindsets or different world hypotheses, like an existential hypothesis or a theological hypothesis. Depending on the grounding of reality, you built this whole edifice of ideas and logical connections. But it was all predicated on these initial assumptions from which it arose. So I think all through my education and what I try to do with my students is to get them to realize that everything is dependent and relative on a particular conceptual frame, right? And you can't spend, and I was like, well, people will say Christianity is the same as Buddhism because look, you can talk about compassion in both. And I said, well, that's true. You can talk about compassion in both, but they're completely different frames of reference grounded in very different traditions with different philosophies and logic, right? So it's important to see the connections, but it's also important to see the differences, right?
Yeah, and actually there I had a question, because whenever I was thinking about mental health and also how we see the world, I always felt that basically our personal philosophy is what holds this view, and almost like if you don't question those assumptions that are on the basis of one's philosophy, we cannot
Mm-hmm.
really build a new world. So I'm curious, um, how do you help patients to actually understand this concept, that it's not such a rigid state, our world, that the worldview is not such a rigid place actually?
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of I use narrative a lot as a model and the ability to edit narratives. And I also think in terms of the myth of the hero,
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Campbell's idea, Jung's idea, thinking in terms of, you live your life based on a set of assumptions and stories, many of which were written by your culture and your family, and some of those fit you well, and maybe others don't. I see this a lot when I work with women, for example, whose personal they're personally striving to learn more and to be in the world and be more powerful. Yet their family narratives are all about them having a husband chosen for them and being a housewife and a mother. And
I must share here, I'm sorry, even my
sure,
friend once she told me, like, you're this incredible scientist, but you were brought up as a housewife.
right.
And it's incredible to see, even in myself, how much, even though you strive for something different, your makeup is completely already conditioned in a different way.
Right, right. And so I think what that leads to, in other words, you can for example, if you were my client, you might leave everything about being a mother and a wife behind because you're focusing so much on being a scientist, and that satisfies some needs, but it
Mm,
doesn't satisfy other needs,
others, yeah.
right? And if all you have is an either or narrative, right? Then what happens is that you start becoming symptomatic to the degree to which you're not really writing a narrative that's as complex as you are,
Yeah.
right? And so that's what I think, as far as the therapy is concerned, is to be able to figure out, like, how would you and I write a narrative together that would attempt to balance the multiple things that you are. And, in realizing there are going to be some ways in which being a mother or a wife or a housewife is going to conflict with being a scientist. But it's not impossible to do those two things. It's just impossible given maybe your mother or your grandmother,
Mm.
right? Because it was sort of an either or world. And, living in Los Angeles, I mean, more than half the people in Los Angeles come from another country. And so I'm constantly, everyone comes from all over the world with their more traditional belief systems. And if they're in Los Angeles, they also have this desire to do something different. Otherwise, they would be back on a farm or in their village, wherever their family came from. And so I think that really, if you could start seeing what I see is that the human brain and society co-evolved with narratives, right? And narratives are a very important part of society and also how we regulate, our own brains. And it's almost like an external neural circuit, narratives, because they play such a strong role in neural integration and also like a guidance system to help us through the day and through our lives. And so in a sense, there's an educational component to therapy to help people realize that and to realize that they actually can make choices about their narrative as opposed to either accepting or rejecting in a binary fashion what their mothers told them.
Yeah, and actually there is something that I find as well interesting in therapies is the creativity of it. And at the end of I feel like a successful therapy, you feel you have the possibility to create worlds, and suddenly the complexity doesn't bother you anymore. So
Mhm.
in terms of creativity, we can come back to that later. Before I forget, in one of your lectures, you say that you cannot have a successful therapy without both cognition and emotion processing. And we talked about narrative, which is more in the cognitive domain. But how do you tackle, or how do you work with the bodily and emotive part?
Well, I mean, I think that a narrative is an integrative function. It is
Mm-hmm.
cognitive. It is left hemisphere. It is sequential. So it's a left frontal language process on the one hand, but also narratives don't make any sense without emotion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And without the body. I mean, the myth of the hero, or the hero's journey, is a very physical process where you have to go through. You climb mountains, you go through the swamps of despair, you do all of those things, and in the process of the narrative, all sorts of emotions get generated. And so I use those to, to sort of look into, and dive deeper into the feelings. In other words, like, you have these ideas, or your a self-image that is keeping you from experimenting or risking being yourself. So what emotions get generated when you imagine betraying your mother by being a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
right? What fear? There's abandonment fear, there's shame, there's despair, there's a sense of, oh, I can never go home again. I'm going to be completely alone, and I'm going to die old alone in my apartment with a bunch of cats. And all of that stuff generates all sorts of emotions, right? That then you can work through. And of course, a lot of times people get frozen too because they've been traumatized in some way. They've been physically or sexually abused, or they've had some horrible experience. And many people, at least in LA, have come through, political. They've been one of my clients was in a building in, I think, in Kosovo, where the building next door where her little friends lived was destroyed, and so she's hanging on to a wall of a floor that's now at a 45-degree angle. It's like trying to yell through the dust and the noise to try to find her mother. I mean, that will make people freeze and solidify and stop growing.
Yeah.
There's a fight, flight, and a freeze
Freeze.
response as well.
Yeah.
And so people can freeze for decades, or they can freeze their whole lives. Another manifestation of trauma is tending, which is a really interesting one, where it's kind of like the Stockholm syndrome, where the people that basically are abusing you, you become their caretaker.
Yeah.
And so it's another way to get stuck, and to it's another freeze response, although it doesn't look the same.
Yeah, those are very, very familiar for me, because you mentioned Kosovo, and I'm from Serbia. So we have,
Mhm.
as I feel, as a collective, we are in a freeze state, and
Yeah,
it takes time.
yeah.
Actually, you mentioned expressing yourself. And when you say self, I'm always interested in this question of authenticity, and what does it mean to express the self?
Mhm.
So, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I, I think when I think about self, I naturally think of identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I like Daniel Dennett's definition of identity. He says that identity is the center of narrative gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the stories that we tell about ourselves, or how we view ourselves. And those stories are both helpful and hurtful, because they provide a foundation and a direction, but they also can create limits, right? So I think, as far as expanding the self, one of the ways in which I work with folks is, and I work with myself, is trying to, and this is kind of hard to articulate, but it's trying to learn to listen to the inner voices. And the voices may not be words, it may be feelings, that may be intuitions or impulses, or, in other words, like Joseph Campbell talked about, following your bliss,
Mm-hmm.
right? what is it that, what is it that makes you feel alive? Where, like for many people, especially people who have children, they describe when their babies were young and they would have their baby on their chest and they would feel their baby fall asleep and they would listen to their baby breathing and they would smell that wonderful smell from the tops of their heads and all. And they would just feel, and they would feel so safe themselves, making the child feel safe. And I think that you have that feeling of there's no place I'd rather be, or there's no place that would be better for me to be or more important for me to be, right? And I think that it's those types of feelings. And oddly enough, I have that feeling. I had that feeling with my son, but also I have that feeling with neuroscience. Like I wake up in the morning and it's like, what new can I learn today? And
Mm,
it never gets old for me,
mm,
So I think discovering neuroscience, when I was studying theology, for example, was just like, it's like, it didn't fit into my narrative,
mhm.
right? It didn't make any sense to anyone around me. All I knew was that every day I wanted to learn a little bit more about the brain. And so then I had to like readjust my narrative,
Yeah.
right? And so, on the other hand, someone could say, listen, you're a theology student, you should be a minister or you should be a priest, and you shouldn't study neuroscience because that's just going to delay. And if I did that, then I might find that I would become symptomatic because I'm cutting off a part of myself that I naturally, have an instinct or a tendency towards. So I think, just in a nutshell, it's opening ourselves up to those feelings and to those impulses and learning to value them and really looking at the narratives that we have as not absolute, but as something that we can constantly edit.
And actually, coming back to all this wide-ranging experiences you had, I'm curious, was there a point of fear and insecurity when is all of this going to merge? Where is all of this going to feel like now I'm using all of my capacities? Because sometimes for gifted people, I feel they often feel out of place because they can do much more. And then it's at point it feels like, as you described, alone, very alone, lonely, sorry. So I'm curious, how was your process in integrating all these parts or these curious parts of you, which in some way had to be satiated?
Mhm.
And was there fear, or for you this was just natural part of curiosity?
Well, there was fear, certainty. I mean, certainly, as far as would I ever be able to develop enough of a singular identity
Mm.
where I could support myself? So I think it was that had I been a wealthy person, had I been born rich, I could see spending my life. I would have built a house. I would have been like like a medieval scientist in my laboratory
A
with my
renaissance man.
yeah, yeah. I would have my little telescope and my microscope, and I would just be, growing peas out in the garden and doing all of these things, dropping apples from trees to look at gravity. But I didn't have that luxury, so I really had to figure out how to make a living. So I think when I found clinical sort of psychotherapy as a potential profession, a lot of things clicked for me because I realized that not only were there fairly discernible skills and a clear identity, but it was a situation where you could use anything else you've learned to your client's benefit. So it felt like a coming together. And I think one of the really important milestones or key points in my life was when after getting my doctoral degree, I decided to get out of research academics
Mm.
because research academics was so narrowing and there was so much pressure for
Yes.
grant writing and publishing and all of those things. I realized that I wouldn't have the freedom to live. So I took a job at teaching at a school where, even as a doctoral student, I think I had published 8 or 9 articles as a doctoral student. And so I already had enough articles published for tenure. So I didn't have to worry about publishing for 10 years. So what I did was for 10 years after I graduated, for the most part, I read literature,
Mm.
right? Because that was a part of my education that really had been, I had left that behind while I was in college studying these other things. And I knew that the best psychologists were authors. I was never very impressed with the field of psychology as an intellectual endeavor, right? But you know, for me, Victor Hugo is probably my, the psychologist I aspire to most. And whenever I visit Paris, I go to visit his apartment at the Place de Vosges, and I sit on the floor reading some of Les Miserables right next to his writing desk.
Oh, wow, that is
That's my
beautiful.
inspiration.
Wow. Well, I have that relationship with Dostoevsky, so I understand that level
Right,
of connection.
right.
And I want to get into talking a little bit about therapy. So, in one of the talks, you are talking about the important things for therapy is unconditional positive regard towards the client. And then the second part, which I find a little bit more interesting to go in depth, is a balance between a sense of safety and a stress.
Hmm.
So and this is not only just for psychology, it's also for learn anything where we want to learn. So I'm curious, how do you sense that in a person you are working with, when there is enough safety that you can challenge them, and how do you actually challenge people in an effective manner?
Well, I think the everyone's physiological arousal is different. They express it in different ways. So I think a lot of it is spending enough time with someone to get to know them
Mm-hmm.
and to really ask those questions and ask a lot. I ask a lot of questions about their internal states. What are they feeling now, and I also sometimes will use like a simple biofeedback device, like a GSR, galvanic skin response thing, and I'll because many people don't have any clue about how aroused they are, so they can't articulate it, and so that becomes a way to build language around discussing how aroused they are. Some people are at a high level of arousal, and they're so anxious, and their amygdalas are so, and their autonomic nervous systems are so hyper aroused, and maybe their vagal systems are underdeveloped to the point where they can't really regulate their emotion. They're always at full speed. And so with those clients, very often, I need to explore medication first
Mm-hmm.
with them to see if we can figure out a way to decrease their level of arousal. And the reason why arousal for me is so primary, because I mean, my understanding of the literature is that at a certain level of arousal, and this will be different for everyone, is that the level of adrenaline and cortisol actually inhibits protein synthesis, right? Which is going to lead to neuroplasticity inhibition. And my assumption is that if someone's going to change in psychotherapy, their brain has to have neuroplastic processes in order to learn new things. Another level of this, which is not identical but certainly regulated, is that the amygdala inhibits the other two executive systems, one in the parietal frontal lobes and the other, the DMN, in a variety of medial brain systems. And you need both parietal frontal executive processing and DMN executive processing for self reflection, for understanding interpretations, to be able to actually do the work where you can have change. I mean, that's where insight is, that's where self reflection is in those other systems. And so the I guess the identification and an understanding of arousal and calming is an important first step. And then after that, your next question was, how do you challenge? And I think the challenges really are about assumptions. For example, if a person goes, if you have 4 or 5 bad relationships in a row, and they all go bad in somewhat the same way, yet you've dated very different people, the first, the way our brains are organized is we try to figure out what's wrong with each of those people, right? We don't think, well, I'm the common element here. Are there some ways in which I'm responsible, or my own inner world is involved in this? And so that's a challenge,
Mm.
right? And there are people, for example, people that are labeled borderline very, very often, they can't attain the level of regulation, of affect regulation, to tolerate those types of challenges. So
Mhm.
those are the people that get up and storm out of the office and slam the doors and, act out and do all sorts of other things. And so there's this double function as far as regulating arousal. One is enhancing plasticity, or allowing plasticity to take place. The other is to allow our three executive systems to be regulated, communicate with each other, and integrate as an aspect of plasticity.
And I'm curious there as well. You talk about affect regulation and also calming and soothing. And in one of the books, I came across something that I experienced, which was that sometimes for example, through yoga or meditation, you try to soothe and regulate, but actually I realized that's not what I need to be doing now. Now I actually need to be very angry and need to be aroused because I don't allow that for myself.
Right.
So I'm actually curious about this because we somehow I feel tend to want to eliminate these aroused state in kind of in the culture at this particular moment, and I'm curious what's your take on this, because I feel like this is like the new way of trying to in a way neglect the negativity that actually is useful sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things. Well, probably the most important thing is that people confuse rage and anger,
Mm-hmm.
right? Rage is a right hemisphere function that is very primitive. That is a reaction to being hurt or being misunderstood or abandoned, right? Maybe not abandoned, but that's it, of being wronged
Mm-hmm.
and of being shamed. So shame and rage go very hand in hand. Anger, on the other hand, is really a left hemisphere function, and it co-evolved with attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Because not only do we have to feed and shelter our young, we also have to protect them from danger, and sometimes we have to fight off other people, right? I think that therapists, for the most part, at least in my experience, are conflict avoidant. So
Yeah.
they tend to lump anger in with shame, and they try to manage anger and decrease it, as opposed to understand when it's appropriate, right? And so I think that's an important distinction, the anger rage distinction, and the positive social aspects of anger, because you don't want people taking advantage of you, and you also don't want people hurting your loved ones or yourself, right? So that's the first piece of it. Another piece of it is that we've inherited a hierarchical primate system having to do with that, where we're alphas and betas and omegas, right? And part of being an alpha is being in touch with your anger,
Mm.
right? And again, your anger, it isn't to be abusive of other people, it isn't to dominate other people. It's simply to assert yourself in a situation and get what is your share of whatever is available, right? And so if you swallow your anger, if you don't let your anger be expressed when it's appropriate, that again, symptoms occur. People they get somatic, the conversion disorders. They become depressed. Freud called, depression was anger turned inward.
Yeah.
There's truth to that, right? So there are all of these aspects, and because we're all primates, we all exist in this hierarchical alpha, beta, omega structure. Even if we don't want to believe it, we live in it,
Mm.
right? And so another added problem for women is that women are told that that if you're angry, you're a bitch.
A bit exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so then there's all that, like, you don't want to be a bitch, don't do you? Like, no man will ever want you. And so there are all of the, and again, that's the narrative. It's like really important for women to learn how to be bitches,
Yeah.
right? In the most positive version
Way.
of that term, right? And it
Yeah.
also, like with John Lewis, the congressman who died last year, and he always talked about getting in good trouble. It's
Mm.
important to get in trouble for a good cause. Just like, and people are very conflicted about this. And then I'll say, well, and I'll ask men and women the same question. I'll say, okay, let's imagine that you're out for a walk, you're in a park with your children, right? Or your child, and you're talking to someone else, a friend, and you notice that there's someone trying to grab your child and abduct them. What are you going to do? And these very nice, sophisticated, repressed people will say, I'll rip their goddamn head off,
Yeah.
right? And my response is exactly, right? It's an appropriate response. And so I think that we really have a reckoning, in not only in psychotherapy but as a culture, to address the thing that you said, which is that it's really important to be angry, right? But the anger has to be within a moral framework. It can't be like what Trump does,
Yeah.
stirring up people who want to, like, destroy the Capitol building. That's just impotent rage. They're feeling taken advantage of, right? The anger is getting angry at prejudice, getting angry at and when you think about what's coming ahead of us over the next 50 years with climate change, there's going to be incredible mass migration,
Yeah.
around the world, people trying to get away from places that are going to be inhabitable in 50 years. And this is really going to test our, compassion versus our fear, and our old perceptions of what life is versus what we're going to have to create to move forward.
Yeah. And just also to talk about therapy, I'm experiencing from a lot of my friends when I talk about therapy, is that sometimes when I share my stories, they would say, oh my God, I'm not sure if I would go because I'm a little bit afraid of what I will discover. And I'm curious to ask you this. What is the worst we can discover in therapy? Because that fear that we have, I feel like at the end we only discover our humanness. So I'm curious, yeah, what's your take on this?
Well, I think that our humanness lies on the other side of our grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when people say they're afraid of what they'll discover, I think what most of them mean is that, they're going to have to go through all of the painful feelings that they've managed to figure out how to keep out of consciousness.
Mm.
And so everybody sort of has a demon down in the basement of their castle, you
Mm.
know, and every once in a while they hear it howling and shaking the bars, and that's what they're afraid of. It's not it's yeah, they're afraid of themselves, because growing up is difficult, especially if you grow up under difficult circumstances, and either that's in your family or in your culture, or war, famine, catastrophe, whatever, genocide. There's a lot of pain, and it isn't just our pain; it's the pain of our parents and the pain of our grandparents and our great grandparents. And so I understand the fear. I
Yeah.
certainly had it. And, I mean, I think if your fear keeps you from going to therapy, your fear is going to keep you from a lot of things, right?
And I'm curious in a personal manner, what's the like truth about life or a pain that you were like that you were unwilling to look at for the longest of time, like in a way your biggest resistance?
Well, I think I don't know. I mean, I think for me, it was, my, it has to do with abandonment, and it has to do with death, you know, and my in the depths of my therapy, what I got to was the fact that my father had me when he was 19 or 20, and I got the attention that he never got,
Mm-hmm.
and so he was very jealous, and I had a lot of fear of him. I was afraid he'd abandon me, but I was more afraid he'd kill me.
Mm.
Right. So that was at the core of a whole lot of issues. And in order to get there, there were many, many, many layers of, I don't know how to say, dissociation,
Mm-hmm.
all layers of narcissistic defenses, on and on and on.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think that is, I think at the core of at the core of everyone's fear probably is abandonment, because
Yes.
abandonment equals death for primates,
Yes.
and then that can take on thousands of different forms.
Forms. Yeah.
But you always get, I've always seen whenever I've worked with anyone, you get to that core feeling of abandonment, and however that manifests shapes your career, it shapes your adult relationships, it shapes your friendships, and it shapes your narrative and self image.
So just to be mindful of your time, I have two more questions. So one of them is, how do you conceptualize success, either in life or in therapy?
Oh, I mean, I think it's just a matter of, I think it's a matter of, like I said early on, like learning that vulnerability is a strength,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that's a core piece, because if you can feel strong in your vulnerability, then life is livable, right?
Mm.
You don't have to be acting; you can just be yourself and discover who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and that's true in therapy and in life. Like Freud said, the purpose of therapy isn't to rub off every sharp edge of a person, right? The purpose of therapy is to get over the defenses and the resistances that keep you from loving and working. So
Mm.
if you can love and work, that's good enough for me, right? Life life is very fragile and very chaotic. We're just animals. We're just biological organisms clinging to a rock that's flying through space. So you got to be careful not to get too fancy about what your dreams are.
Yeah. And the last one is, um, I was thinking about basically the way I exercise and the way I lift weights, and how easy it is to conceptualize that process and say, every day when I wake up, I will put a little bit on more weight and I know exactly what I'm exercising, and then I kind of am able to shape that. But when it comes to the mind, we cannot have this progressive overload, or maybe we can if we know enough. And I'm curious if you have this idea of a mind map that would help us to understand what are we exercising in this particular moment. And your book actually really does that incredibly well. But I'm curious for the listeners if you can maybe talk about this in a nutshell.
Yeah, I would say, in answer to that question, I would probably evoke like a Buddhist perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
just say, our minds are sort of like an onion with infinite layers, and so every day it's important for us to unlearn something about ourselves.
Mm.
Where we're open to new experiences, like how do you remain a child? How do you become fascinated with watching a bug crawl across the ground, or the way sunlight bounces off of a certain piece of glass or something like that. I think that really is the if every day we can have a moment where we can grasp a child's mind,
Mm.
right, and become a human doing as opposed to a human being, then I think we're doing as well as can be expected.
Yeah. And just the rapid fire questions to wrap up. So what is one absurd thing about you that not many people know about?
Absurd?
Yeah. Unexpected.
God, I don't know if there's anything absurd about me.
That's also fine. That's
Yeah, I can't. I'm thinking. I mean, I'm sure there are, right? I just am not thinking. One of the time that I feel most absurd is when I go to sleep at night. I have to wear a mouth guard, right?
Oh,
Because I grind my teeth,
okay.
and then I have to wear a mask with an oxygen hose because I have apnea.
Okay.
So then I put that on, and then I put a hood on, and then over that I put headphones because I usually listen to like a book on tape or something as I'm falling asleep. So if you saw me in bed at night, I'm sure you would think I was absurd because I look like I'm in an intensive care unit, right?
Yeah, that's why I like these questions, because a lot of these things come
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
And one more is, if you are to interview someone alive or dead, and you haven't had the chance to talk to that person, who would that be?
Oh, wow. God, so many people come to mind. So
You
many
can
people.
say several.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the first person that I would want to, I mean, Buddha came to mind first, but I don't think he would be very helpful. I think he would just smile at me for asking questions. But I think I'd really be interested in talking to Einstein. And not because I'm interested in physics per se, but because I'm really interested in the process of how he converted mathematical formulas into visual images and manipulate. Because I'm interested in the parietal lobes and how visual images and imagination take place. So he would be a first person. I did get to spend time with Temple Grandin, who's an autistic woman who's developed all of the cattle
Oh,
processing.
yes.
Yeah, she wrote a great book called Thinking in Pictures. And so I did get a chance to spend time in an hour with her and talk to her and ask. So I'd like to ask Einstein the same questions I asked Temple.
Wow. And well, we don't have time, but I would be curious to listen to the answers.
Next episode.
Next episode. Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, I actually do hope there will be some next episode once when your schedule is again cleared, because yeah, I have many more questions.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You have just heard the story of Dr. Lou Cozolino, a practicing psychotherapist and professor at Pepperdine University in LA. He's lecturing around the world on psychotherapy, neuroscience, trauma, and attachment. His primary method as a therapist is one of connection, attunement, and interaction. If you want to connect with him, you can find him on Instagram at Dr. Cozolino & Co. or read more in depth about his work on www.drloucozolino.com and find his books on Amazon and other bookstores. Thank you for joining me for this episode, and I hope you will come along with me on this journey.